心理学家的学术研讨会哈。那今天非常荣幸可以担任今天下午这个第一场的终身成就贡献奖的主题演讲的主持人哈。好，那早上叶匡辉老师好像有提到哈，就是这一届的大会，我们总共呢颁发3个终身成就贡献奖哈。那现在就容我花一点时间介绍第一位终身成就贡献奖的得主伍锡宏教授哈。好，那伍教授呢毕业于香港大学社会科学系哈，他在那边拿到了学士跟硕士的学位，之后就前往英国的布里斯特大学也就是 University of Bristol 哈拿到博士学位。他在拿到博士学位之后呢就到了纽西兰去任教。那曾经先后在纽西兰的威灵顿维多利亚大学，也就是 Victoria University of Wellington 哈，还有香港城市大学哈 City University of Hong Kong， 还有中国人民大学这几个学校任教。那他同时也是纽西兰老化研究所的联合创办人，跟纽西兰皇家科学院的院士哈。那他主要的研究的领域呢是社会心理学相关的研究跟应用。那他主要的研究主题呢包括权力关系、语言、社会身份认同理论、老龄化或者是高龄化还有人类价值观，以及华人在跨文化接触跟全球化影响之下的中西自我概念跟脑神经的研究记得很多年前他有出版了一本有关华人自我的这样的书籍。那他总共发表了很多本专书，还有100多篇的文章。那在那个学术上面，他也曾经担任国际语言跟社会心理学会的会长、亚洲社会心理学会的会长那他也曾经在香港特区政府呢担任公职包括担任香港特区政府临时最低工资委员会的成员，跟中央政策组非全职的顾问因此呢伍锡宏教授在学术上面不管是在研究应用还有这个在这个在政策上面都有一些他的很长远的一些贡献。那因此我们颁发这个终身成就贡献奖给他那今天他要讲的这个主题他的演讲的主题是长者跟疫情那他有先预录了一段影片，那等一下呢我们就会在现场呢播放这部影片那请大家那个聆听。好，谢谢。
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my conference presentation. I am Sik Hung. I thank the conference organizers for the opportunity to speak on the topic of the elderly and the pandemic. It is a topic that is consistent with the theme of the conference and a big concern to me as an elderly person. Much as I wish I could be with you in person, the COVID pandemic made it difficult for me to travel from Hong Kong to Taipei. I thank the conference support team for pre-recording my speech and the PowerPoint slides. It is a huge honor for me to accept the Lifetime Achievement Contribution Award from my fellow Chinese psychologists. When preparing for this talk, I have received encouragement and comments from many individuals. Many are elderly like me. Thank you all. Next slide. The COVID pandemic has affected numerous individuals, some more tragically than others. It will eventually peter out, but the definite time remains uncertain, given the rapid mutations of the virus. My talk comprises 3 sections. I will first address the question, who are the elderly? This will take us back to the mid-1940s, immediately after World War II. Today, the pandemic generated many stories about the elderly that ought to be told and heard. This will be summarized in section B. In the final section, I will pull together research on positive aging and relevant Chinese humanistic values to show that the elderly should and can take more control of their lives and live positively to old age for self and others. Sorry. My talk is essentially about rediscovering and understanding the elderly through the lens of the pandemic. It is in everybody's interest to know more about the elderly, since, stating the obvious, everyone, including the young and not so young, will eventually become an elderly and be treated as such. For these and other reasons, a case can be made to develop a Chinese psychology that is more inclusive of and meaningful to the elderly. I will elaborate on this point near the end of my talk and relate it to the conference theme, which is to explore what a Chinese psychology is like in the aftermath of the pandemic. Next slide. Who are the elderly? They are defined by the United Nations as persons 65 years or older. In 2020, there were 723 million of them. This is a huge 9% of the global population, or 30 times the population of Taiwan. The majority of elderly are made up of 65 to 74-year-olds, the so-called post-World War II baby boomers. I am one of them. Many of you probably are also. Our large number is due to 2 main factors. The first was an explosive increase in childbirth triggered by men returned from the battlefield and societies began to recover economically and socially. The second factor was that most newborns were fortunate enough to have survived and lived to old age. Next slide. Less well known about the elderly is that they were actually a principal player in a quiet revolution. The revolution has a happy beginning, but an unsettling end. The beginning started while the elderly were in the youth, forming an increasingly huge labor force that created wealth for society, a phenomenon known as the population boomers. The elderly have played a part in post-war recovery and development. But as they approached older years, they were prematurely squeezed out of the labor force to retirement. For many, they would mean 10 or more years without a job before becoming unsuitable for full-time paid work. The large and still increasing number of retirees is unprecedented in human history. Society is hence wasting an otherwise productive and experienced social resource, reducing it to a social burden instead. For example, a study in Australia found that if 5% more people 55 years or older were employed, this would add 4,800 million Australian dollars to the national economy every year. When more and more elderly are becoming retirees, fewer and fewer babies are born. These are not enough to replenish the labor force. These two factors resulted in a rapid and unprecedented population worldwide. Population is measured by the proportion of elderly in the population. When it's over 7%, it is aging. 14% is aged, and 20% is super aged. According to these criteria, the world in 2022 is an aging world with 9% of elderly people. The mainland is aging at 12%. Taiwan, Hong Kong, and South Korea are aged. Japan, with a higher 26%, is super aged society. These are alarming figures. The world is clearly failing in adapting to the demographic changes and has not found a way forward for the common good of the elderly and the young. One wonders, what is the meaning of long life? Is long life to be enjoyed or to be endured? Is it a blessing or a curse? Next slide. We come now to stories of the elderly under the pandemic. The COVID-19 outbreak was declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization on the 11th of March 2020, nearly 2.5 years ago. It has followed a path largely similar to that of other epidemics in human history. It is like a drama, playing out one act after another act. At first, communities were reluctant or uncertain to accept an epidemic was happening. But as the sick keep turning up to hospitals and dead bodies piled up, the truth of the matter was exposed. The painful truth demanded an explanation of the seeming randomness of what was happening. Why some particular individuals, but not others, have been infected, and why among those infected, some will recover while others have perished. In this phase of the tragedy, explanations have been proposed, and these have defined public health policy and choices being taken by various health authorities. The public policy and ethical choices are whether to put saving lives above keeping business as usual or vice versa. Stringent measures to prevent and control the pandemic would save lives, such as compulsory wearing of face masks, social distancing, restrictions on social gathering and visitation, quarantine, and a lockdown. However, these measures would disrupt businesses, supply chains, and normal living. Had the pandemic subsided quickly, the measures would have been more bearable, but it hasn't. The protracted grip of the pandemic makes the prevention and control measures harder and harder to sustain. The availability of vaccines, far from being the instant savior that the public has been led to believe, has actually been met with mixed receptions in some communities. The considerable refusals or hesitations effectively prolonged the time taken to raise vaccination to community-wide immunity level. And even among populations that have achieved a high level of immunity, new and more infectious mutants of the virus would appear to restart the tug of war. Throughout the pandemic tragedy, we can find elderly tales. Let us go through some of them. Next slide. According to global data gathered before the pandemic, 1 in 2 people held negative ageist attitudes towards older persons. This fact may seem unbelievable, but it is real. With the outbreak of the pandemic, there is a parallel outbreak of ageism. A 2020 systematic review of studies show that in 85% of the studies, age determined who will receive certain medical procedures for treatment. The world witnessed firsthand what many people who work in aged care or related gerontological fields already knew and have been trying to raise the alarm bell for years. Long-term care systems in many parts of the world that were already badly under-resourced and understaffed were quickly overwhelmed. The consequences of ageism have never been more apparent. Ageism, before and during the pandemic, challenges filial piety as a desirable social norm. Next slide. At the personal level, the stories of the elderly are disturbing. The rates of elderly death from infection are many times higher than the global average. Elderly abuse, such as financial scams and family violence or neglect, has increased. During the prevention and control phase of the pandemic, the elderly probably suffer more than other age groups from social distancing, home isolation, restriction on visitation, quarantine, and lockdown. These restrictions have been imposed over protracted periods of time. Many elderly fail the endurance test, and many more suffer from prolonged social isolation and deprivation of social support. Those who live in rest homes were isolated inside and subject to cross-infections. Many will never see their relatives again. These physical and emotional injuries are relatively obvious. Such suffering occur alongside heroic stories of rest home carers who persevere with the duties, although they themselves have fallen ill due to overwork. Next slide. The elderly have also sustained injuries that may not be immediately obvious. These delayed harms include health deterioration due to the cancellation of medical consultations, accelerated frailty arising from pandemic depression, and the erosion of self-efficacy, and a jump in suicidal attempts and ideations. Next slide. When vaccines were put out by drug companies, authorities approved the use under emergency regulations that exempted the companies from legal liabilities should vaccination cause death or severe side effects. Vaccination was on a voluntary basis at the user's own risk. Should one discount the risk and affirm the vaccine's life-saving efficacy, in community protection, or to focus on the risk and doubt the efficacy of vaccines. The two cognitive styles which will lead to opposite decisions are called positive and negative framing, respectively. Studies on why the vaccination rate is low among the elderly have attributed the cause to negative framing, colored blue in the slide. The negative framing directly leads to decisions to refuse vaccination or hesitate over it. What factors lead to negative framing rather than positive framing? There are three such factors, and these are highlighted red in the slide. The first factor is the elderly's own self-ageism, believing themselves to be vulnerable and not strong enough to accommodate the side effects of the vaccine. The second factor is their relatives' overprotective ageism. These two factors stem from ageism in society at large that have been internalized by the elderly and their relatives. The third factor is anti-vaccination narratives, which inflate the harms over the efficacy of vaccines. The end result of refusing or delaying vaccination is that many elderly people have paid with their lives. Who are to blame? The elderly themselves and the overprotective relatives certainly have to bear some of the blame. Yet, the major culprit are existent ageism in society that has been internalized by the elderly and their relatives and exploited by anti-vaccination narratives. In Hong Kong, the low vaccination rate among the elderly could be attributed to the lack of government efforts to practically assist the elderly to receive vaccination and to a relatively low level of public trust in the early phase of the government's promotional campaign to vaccinate the elderly. There were mixed messages in the public domain about the various vaccines. Up to the end of 2021, the pandemic in Hong Kong has relatively been well controlled. But in the first 6 months of 2020, that is this year, the number of COVID-19 reported deaths in Hong Kong totaled 9,186. Over 90% were people 70 years or older. It is a sad story. Next slide. According to a recent global survey, people are getting sick and tired of sad news about the pandemic after being bombarded by such news in the past 2 years. The news aversion and fatigue suggest that people no longer want to know, or worse still, no longer care. Who cares even if a relatively small number of lives would be lost? To sum up some of the elderly stories, let me quote from the account of a primary school classmate of mine. Quote, "For myself, being in the 70, 80 age group, I really feel the impact of reduced activity levels for 2 years. Muscle mass loss and stiffening joints seem to have accelerated the physical aging process. I visited my physiotherapist over 15 times last year to treat various pains and aches. I think what affected me the most was the amount of information and misinformation that were out there during the pandemic. It became increasingly hard for me to follow even the key facts, some of which were significant and affected me and everyone else personally. For example, how does the virus affect us? How it is transmitted? The development of vaccines, how vaccines work, and how the virus is changing, and so forth. Information and misinformation proliferated in the news and social media. I used to be able to distinguish what are likely facts, or science-based statements, and what are not. And I can do research on the web to validate or refute the claims. With the proliferation of misinformation, and Google search no longer produce objective results easily as they once did, it became impossible to follow issues objectively easily. The thought that I used to be able to do this, but now I cannot, certainly cast some doubts on my ability to function the way I expected of myself. I think this is the impact I felt the most, end quote. I'm sure that there are countless other stories like this. As society rushed off to recover from the pandemic, disruption, and compensate for lost time and lost opportunities, the elderly are likely to be left behind. What should the elderly do? Instead of playing the role of the weak and pitiful, dependent on others' mercy, the elderly should think and act positively. This brings us to the final part of my talk. Next slide. Living to old age, living to old age and then dying is a biological imperative. Our skins begin to wrinkle, hairs turn gray, bodies become shorter. We become forgetful. Gradually, we notice our social circles are shrinking. Old friends and relatives becoming less mobile or having passed away. These visible and subjectively felt signs bring about a sense of nearing death. And the elderly begin to estimate how much time is remaining to live. They will ponder over what to do with it. Different people respond differently to the subjective estimate of time remaining in life. Positive aging would advise accepting the biological imperative and resolving to live out old age positively as the final stage of a fulfilling life. There are plenty of rules of wisdom in Chinese folklore that advise the same positive orientation to old age. I have selected a few to show on the slides. In psychological terms, such a positive orientation will require optimism, a belief in self-efficacy, and self-motivation to act. Behaviorally, the positive elderly follow the way of heaven and earth. According to the Book of Changes, and a quote from translation, heaven moves with incessant vitality. Earth holds the world with selfless virtues, end quote. Following the way of heaven, the elderly strive for self-vitality by maintaining health and functioning for as long as possible, and by compressing mobility to a minimum and for the shortest time possible. Following the way of earth, the elderly engage with others and community through love and care, and by work and services with a virtuous heart. These humanistic ideas concerning positive attitude and meaningful behaviors also came out clearly in focus group discussions that my co-workers and I have conducted in our positive aging studies. Next slide. The research and development of positive aging are part of a wider academic movement. The movement comprises positive psychology, old age life course development, and gerontology that brings together social, behavioral, medical, and neurological studies of the elderly. At the same time, positive aging research is stimulated by policy needs for more knowledge to solve the serious health, social security, and economic problems associated with population aging. These policy needs are increasingly pressing on local and national governments. The World Health Organization and the United Nations have long urged the member nations to develop policies that will safeguard elderly rights and address ageism. Next slide. In the final stage of its development, positive aging research owes much to 5 precursors as summarized in the slide. Positive aging can be seen as an attempt to incorporate elements of aging that are already evident in healthy aging, positive aging, productive aging, successful aging, and the work of Erickson and his associates on vital involvement in old age. The next slide will show the 4 key domains or dimensions of positive aging. Next slide. The 4 domains of the conceptual model of positive aging, summarized on the left side of the diagram, are health, functioning, love and care, and work and services. Each domain was measured by 4 to 5 items shown on the right side of the diagram. The measurement model was then tested and confirmed in a longitudinal study. The overall sample of nearly 3,000 ethnic Hong Kong Chinese was stratified according to age groups between 40 and 74 years. Over 70% of the sample participated in the follow-up study 1 year later, the results of which replicated the earlier findings. The model was then validated based on known groups. Next slide. The overall sample shows that health and functioning scores are generally above the scores of love and work. They are mostly over the mid-level of the 5-point scale. Health, functioning, and particularly work declined with old age. Love, the brown line, holds up across the age groups, as you can see. Retirement, around 55 to 64 years, restores functioning and love, but loses out on work as one would expect. Some other results not shown on the slide are as follows. Are there any gender differences? Compared to men, women had poorer health and functioning, but more love and did not differ on work. How about marriage? Being currently married was good for love and bad for functioning. Higher education was good for love and work, but made no difference to health and functioning. Next slide. Some suggested applications of positive aging to the current pandemic situation are grouped under 2 headings. What the elderly can do for themselves and what they can do for others. For self, it is important that the elderly desensitize the phobia of infection and overcome the repercussions of pandemic isolation. Counseling, clinical, community, and gerontological psychologists can play a role in disseminating and explaining relevant information to speed up reconnecting with society and catching up on lost time. There is a vast research literature on how to do this successfully for the elderly to regain self-confidence and self-efficacy and to free themselves from the mental trap of self-ageism. Next slide. For others, the elderly will participate actively in the revival and renewal of society following the pandemic. The elderly have accumulated extensive social networks, and these can be put to good use to raise the level of social capital in society. Previous studies have shown that social capital contributes to social recovery from wars and other disasters. Many elderly are fit enough for part-time productive work and voluntary services. Through these productive engagements, the elderly can promote solidarity with younger generations and become more self-reliant with greater self-respect. It is also beneficial to the health and functioning. With the increasing number of elderly people, the potential influence and power will increase. Politically, they can influence governments and businesses to work towards the creation of a more inclusive society for all ages. As everyone will become an elderly person, an inclusive society will eventually benefit everyone. Earlier studies have shown that filial piety cannot remain unchanged when society is undergoing wider social, economic, and demographic changes. The pandemic experience is a further reminder that the actual practice of filial piety is not functioning as satisfactorily as one would have expected. As an elderly person myself, I think we should take the initiative of reflecting on the modern meaning of filial piety and redefine its bounds and social expectations in realistic terms. Put it another way, we should direct the change that we want to make and make a constructive contribution in re-envisioning what filial piety should be like in modern times. Next slide. It is time to draw our session to a close. In doing so, I will offer two suggestions with reference to the theme of the conference. The conference theme is to prospect or chart the future 10 years of Chinese psychology in the aftermath of the pandemic. I understand this to be an open invitation to envision some of the features of Chinese psychology that reflects on and takes stock of the pandemic experience rather than to carry on as if the pandemic has never happened. Looking back, the elderly have come a long way and left their marks in history. Now in the old age, they are met by an unwelcome pandemic that has stolen 2.5 years of the time and is still lingering on, greedy for more. We should not allow the pandemic to waste more of our time. In the long months and days just past, the pandemic has revealed how a society treats its elderly citizens, and the particular ways the elderly perceive, experience, and respond to the pandemic. These and other psychological data will be useful for understanding the elderly and societies in the mainland, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, Singapore, Malaysia, and elsewhere. It will provide an opportune base for collaborative research. Qualitative in-depth studies will be particularly useful to complement data coming out of online surveys conducted by the Sik Hung Project and other cross-cultural research initiatives. Now, in the longer run, I hope such efforts would help develop a Chinese psychology that is more relevant to the rapidly aging world. In this psychology, the elderly are visible. It will tell about how the brains, bodies, and minds work, and give voice to their bio-historical experiences as baby boomers, creators of population boomers, retirees, pensioners, and perhaps also as migrants, now living away from the place of birth. This is depicted in the upper picture of the slide. Looking forward, I will make a second suggestion. You may recall that I have referred briefly to historians of pandemic and epidemics. These scholars have found time and again that as the infectious disaster subsides or appear to be petering out, humankind quickly become complacent and enter a state of collective amnesia, trying to forget rather than to reflect on and learn from the experience. Chinese psychologists should resist the collective amnesia. There is a real need to figure out how the community and government, should the next pandemic or epidemic strike again, may better maintain credibility in its warning systems, sustain public support for costly preparedness planning, and keep the public vigilant, but not alarmed, panic-stricken, or completely disengaged. Psychologists have considerable expertise in these areas and can play a useful role by undertaking a psychological inquiry into the prevention and control of the COVID pandemic, the human responses to these government measures, how psychological pains and interpersonal relations are being healed or not healed, and ways in which collective human behavior may play its role in social, economic, and political recovery from the pandemic. Making policy-related recommendations through research are one of the marks that Chinese psychology is coming of age, that it is maturing as a scientific and humanistic endeavor worthy of public funding and support. I would hope that post-pandemic Chinese psychology will move along in this direction using the COVID pandemic as an impetus, in addition to its various other scholarly initiatives. It is likely that initiatives are already underway and deserve support from the Conference of Chinese Psychologists. With these suggestions, I end my session. Thank you for your attention. God bless and goodbye.